All right. Thanks. It's an incredible honor to be here. I think this is a really exciting conference for a really exciting moment in all of our fields, so thank you for including me. I'm charged with representing the cognitive science perspective, which I have characterized in this way as reverse engineering the mind. I think reverse engineering is something hopefully we can all agree on. I definitely am more of the three-petal flower paradigm than the gladiator perspective, I have to say. And I'm realizing that the slides are a little bit different than the aspect ratio. Well, anyway, we'll deal with this. The bottom of some of the slides might get a little cut off, but all right. Again, I think all of us here are familiar with Marr's famous levels of explanation, which is really a guide for a landscape of reverse engineering, right? We can talk about the computational theory level, in which we ask, what is the problem to be solved for some cognitive system? And what is the logic by which it is carried out? What are the inputs and the outputs that specify the problem? And how, in principle, might it be achieved? The algorithmic level is where we talk about actually what are the step-by-step, or whatever, it could be parallel, but the algorithmic processes that implement that computation, and then what we sometimes call the implementation level, what are the hardware mechanisms. And while one could try identifying these different levels with different fields, I think another maybe more subtle way to put it, which is very much in the spirit of the opening mental model, is to think about our different disciplines as representing different paths through these levels. We all want to connect and bridge them. The question is, where do you start and what trajectory do you follow? What do you, with your toolkit, what you're distinctively best at, and most satisfied with, where do you go and where do you start? So I very, very roughly see the cognitive science perspective as a top-down one, starting by thinking about what is the problem to be solved, and then moving down through successive levels of implementation. Whereas, again, very, very roughly, I think of the neuroscience perspective as starting from the bottom and working up. And there are people whose work represents attempts to go from the middle out or from both directions simultaneously. I think the neural network approach in either AI or cognitive science can be seen as kind of starting with a certain idea of what the algorithms are like. Let's say end-to-end differentiable programs, right? And then learning algorithms that exploit that, like gradient descent. And then sort of moving up and down, seeing what computations can we do with this toolkit, and how might this help us make sense of the brain. Now, for me, that's not my approach, although I do use some neural networks in what I do. I want to articulate why I see, or where I see the distinctive value in the cognitive science approach. It's not to say it's the best one. I'm trying to articulate why I and people like me do what we do and what we think we have to offer to this whole mix. And I think one way to motivate this is to, again, in the spirit that you already saw, think about all the great successes that we've had recently in engineering. Right? AI is back in a big way. In many ways, it's real. But I think it's also fair to say that these AI technologies, these systems that do things that we used to think only human minds could do, none of them are real AI, right? And there's many reasons for that. But to me, the most salient one, and most salient to many cognitive scientists, is that they don't get at what is, to us, maybe the most fundamental kinds of computations the human mind does. A kind of very flexible general purpose intelligence, a mind that can do all of these things, that doesn't have to be specially engineered, like, for example, AlphaGo or a self-driving car or IBM Watson Jeopardy player, each of which is specially engineered at great cost to do one thing. Your mind can do all of these things and doesn't have to be specially engineered. The only person who programmed it is evolution and you. Okay? So how does that work? What is missing, let's say, from our current engineering toolkit that's allowed us to build these special purpose technologies that might help us reverse engineer this more flexible general purpose notion of human cognition? Okay. That's what I try to get at in my work, and many of us in our field. And one way to see what's missing is to look at what has driven a lot of the success. Certainly what's gotten much of the attention recently is a particular set of AI technology or AI methods coming from neural networks, right? This is a picture which I think everybody here is probably familiar with. You'll see versions of this if you haven't over the course of the next few days. I'm not going to rehearse it here. I'm just going to illustrate how this success story in our broad field really represents what you could see as this middle-out approach, right? Maybe starting with some rough ideas, first from, say, Hubel and Wiesel, some circuit motifs in cortex, but then turning those into big scalable algorithms, many, wide and deep, and then seeing what can you do with that? What kinds of, let's say, character recognition challenges, problems can you solve, or what kind of object recognition problems can you solve? Problems like the ImageNet challenge, thousands of image categories, thousands of object categories, thousands of examples of each one, and that's just scaled up and out from there, right? And now computer vision people are solving, in industry in particular, problems with hundreds of thousands or millions of object categories. And then as Jim and some of his colleagues and a number of others have shown, you can take that toolkit back and make sense of the brain. Okay. But I'm not going to go into that here. I'm just going to say this is a success story, but what is it really about? And what is it missing? Well, again, from I think let's call it a cognitive computational perspective, what I think we've come to realize, and in some sense maybe always known, is that what this toolkit is best at is a set of computations that we could call pattern recognition. Okay, where this does best, where this clearly just sort of beats all the others on both the engineering side and science, is things that can be where you're trying to find some kind of patterns across a big data set that are diagnostic of, let's say, a class boundary or some kind of regression target. But intelligence is about much more than pattern recognition. It's many things, but the one that I'd like to focus on, and which, again, very broadly, if I can speak at all for cognitive science, I think this has been central to the field of cognitive science since its beginning, is the idea of intelligence as model building and the mind as a modeling engine. And that means the brain, in some sense, has to be a modeling engine. So we don't just recognize patterns in what we see, but we explain and understand what we see. Okay? We imagine things that we could see but haven't yet. We make plans and solve problems in order to make those things real. And then when we're learning, that means building new models as we experience more, as we realize what maybe our models are missing. Okay? If you're interested, one of the things that's cut off on this slide is if you're interested in a much longer treatment of this, with a few colleagues, Brendan Lake, Tomer Ullman, and Sam Gershman, we have a paper coming out in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I know a number of you here have written commentaries on it, so some of you already know it, but you can read it on arXiv. It's called Building Machines That Learn and Think Like People, and it really tries to articulate what this is all about. What I'm going to talk about here in this talk are, just to give you a couple of case studies from the work that we've been doing recently, to highlight how, coming from cognitive science, what's hard and interesting about this problem of model building. Right now, we are much less far along in understanding how this works in the mind and brain than we are with pattern recognition. Yet we are beginning to understand some of the fundamental computational ideas and algorithmic principles, and even to maybe suggest some targets for implementation levels, or let's say circuit level neuroscience. So I want to try to map out, following this top-down route, what are we learning about computations, algorithms, and even maybe just learning what we don't know at the implementation level that our field can offer to the bigger community here. And I'm going to talk about two areas: common sense scene understanding and what you could call, I guess, rapid model-based learning. I'll spend most of the time on the first place, where the neuroscience link is already starting to happen through mostly work that my colleagues have been doing that I've been collaborating with. We'll talk a little bit about the other at the end. But just to say a little bit more what I mean here, when I talk about common sense scene understanding, I mean not just how do we look at let's say a visual scene and not just do object recognition, not just recognize what is where, as Marr famously said, but to really understand what's going on, to see, as I like to say, a whole world of physical objects and intentional agents and their interactions, a kind of intuitive physics or intuitive psychology, right? The mind's own intuitive theories of the physical world and the psychology of what's going on inside other minds that guide our interactions with the world. This is the heart of common sense, and we want to understand how it works in the mind and brain. And then by model-based learning, I mean how, for example, can we learn a new concept not from thousands of examples, but maybe from just one? Or, for example, in what's sometimes called reinforcement learning, how can we learn a complex new skill, like playing a new game or using a new tool, not necessarily in thousands of hours, as in current reinforcement learning systems in AI, but maybe in just 10 minutes or just 2 minutes. Okay. And what I want to emphasize, and when I talk about the way computational cognitive scientists approach these things, is the big toolkit of engineering tools that we're bringing to bear. So neural networks have long been, and are certainly now, one of the main kind of good ideas from engineering that guides our reverse engineering. But I want to highlight at least two others, and I really think that the 3 bullet points that you see here represent maybe the 3 or 3 of the best ideas that humanity has had about intelligence, certainly in any of our lifetimes, but maybe ever. One is the idea of thinking about probabilistic inference in generative models, so models that in some ways describe the causal structure of the world, where a probabilistic framework of inference tells you how to use and learn those models. So graphical models, Bayesian networks are examples of this. The other, and if I had to choose one as most fundamental, I won't, but if I had to like line up with one as the gladiator, whatever, it would clearly be symbol processing architectures. So the idea of programming languages, or just symbolic computation, which is the oldest of these ideas. It goes back at least to Aristotle. And it's the one that without that one, there would be none of the others. We would have no neural networks, we would have no graphical models. None of us would be able to do any of the things that we're doing without the idea of symbolic computation as a broad framework for algorithmic accounts of intelligence. But what's exciting is how all these tools are coming together. So in our work, these days we talk a lot about what we call probabilistic programs, which is really an idea, a toolkit that integrates all of these. For those of you who aren't familiar with probabilistic programs, a cutoff reference here. This is from a figure from Zubin Garmani, who had a paper in Nature on probabilistic AI. This is a figure from that paper. He has a nice little introduction there, Nature 2015, again, Zubin Garmani. And there's a tutorial web book by Noah Goodman and me a little bit, which is called probmods.org, probmods, Probmods.org. And you can learn a lot about probabilistic programs there with lots of web browser-based examples. Okay. And the idea of this toolkit, you can think of it if you're familiar with Bayesian networks or directed graphical models. It's a generalization of that. Okay. It's a framework for probabilistic modeling, and directed meaning it's causal. Okay. But the reason why we talk about programs rather than networks is because we want to use the full toolkit of computer science and programming languages, data structures and algorithms in particular, for describing and building much richer models that really describe the really fine-grained causal texture of the world. I'll illustrate that in a moment. When we and others first started to develop this, maybe about 10 years ago, this toolkit, we definitely were not thinking about neural networks as something that was part of this toolkit. But increasingly, with all the things that have been happening in that approach, we and others, and I would highlight, this is something that Noah, for example, is especially interested in, but really anybody, if you in the local community here, I don't know if Dave Bly or people from his group at Columbia are here. I don't know, Dave is actually, he's one of the leaders in probabilistic AI and also probabilistic programs from a more statistical point of view with, for example, their Edwards system. He's also contributed some to cognitive neuroscience. But he's another example of somebody who is along with, say, Noah and people in our group, integrating neural networks as part of this toolkit. So we're excited about the language of probabilistic programs and the tools people are building on the engineering side, which will let you bring all of these ideas together. And unfortunately, the very last thing here is the biggest challenge, I think, for this community is how could any of this work in the brain, okay, at the level of neural circuits? So let's say the traditional, maybe it's the cosine level of computational neuroscience, okay, the circuit level, the implementation level. I think, neural networks have natural suggestions. I mean, neural networks as engineering tools, but these two other good ideas of probabilistic generative models and symbol processing, we're only at the very earliest stages, or I would say for probabilistic models, and hardly there at all at the symbol processing sense, for understanding how any of these ideas, let alone the synthesis that you're starting to see in probabilistic programs, how could those work in neural circuits? So what I want to try to say to people who are interested in that approach here, I want to try to make some of the case for why we should care about that challenge and then set it out there as a target that we should be working on. So, okay. Let me, okay, I've got this timer here, all right. So let me start now going into my first case study of common sense scene understanding. So again, I said things like intuitive physics or intuitive psychology. So I mean, for example, how do you look at these scenes on the left and not just see the objects, but see what's going on physically? So in the workshop scene, you see what is supporting what. That if, for example, the table were removed, some of those objects would fall. Or if you bumped the table, some of them might fall or roll off and others wouldn't. Or that scene of the house being built there, right? You see the pieces of wood, but you don't have to know anything about how to build a house to know that if that's a stable scene, if it's not moving visually, then those objects have to be stable physically, which means they have to be attached in various ways. There have to be nails or brackets. You can't see the nails or brackets because they're less than 1 pixel, all right? But you know that they're there, and you have some idea of where they'd have to be. Or that scene, again, a little bit cut off of the cups and dishes there in my local cafe. It's basically some cups and dishes in a bin, and the barista knew that he said that's a disaster waiting to happen. He knew that he'd have to restack them before he went to go bust those dishes, and any of you knows that too. These scenes on the right represent more what we'd call intuitive psychology in scene understanding. So you don't just see these people and get a sense of their relations to each other, but you have some idea of what they're thinking, what they want from the other person, what they want from their joint activity, what they think the other person might be thinking, and so on. Okay? So how do we look at scenes and very quickly get such a rich interpretation of what's going on? You can see this, I think, the core of this, in not just in these more complex scenes that adults look at, like us, but just look at scenes of children playing with blocks and playing with each other. You can see everything there. Or these scenes of animal intelligence. So here on the top, you see an orangutan doing something with very large Legos. Both of these are videos from YouTube. Since time is short, I'll just sort of skip through this, but over the course of the video, what you see is the orangutan appearing to assemble a really quite remarkable Lego structure. Now, I say appearing because there's some debate on the internet. Many people think this is a fake video in that they think that it's played backwards. Or some people think this. Namely, that somebody built this thing and then the orangutan disassembled it. But if you go back and watch, it's very hard to tell, and that itself is interesting. Even if he's just disassembling it, that is really impressive. Okay? So there's some really impressive physical scene understanding going on there. Okay? Or if you look at this mouse down here, this is a video that I learned about from Christoph Koch, who used it to illustrate or argue for the mouse in this video being conscious. I don't disagree with that. I think he's probably right. But watch this mouse valiantly struggling with this cracker, trying to get that thing up over the wall, maybe to his nest. It's really quite a challenge, and at some point he's just going to give up. Let's see. Poor mouse, he gave up. But because he's a smart mouse, and a brave mouse, he goes back, and finally he gets it over. Yeah, it's great. Okay, so these are inspiring, and touching, but not just from a Hollywood sense, but they should inspire us scientifically. Because if these animals can do these things, then what I'm talking about, we should be able to study in the brain, not just with the human cognitive neuroscience toolkit, but with the systems neuroscience toolkit, and ultimately take the kind of models and the engineering and the reverse engineering we're doing down to the circuit level. So what are the models that, from the top-down approach, we start with? Well, the kind of probabilistic programs we build, I said, again, these are probabilistic generative models that we build not on top of graphs, but on top of algorithms and data structures. What kind of algorithms and data structures? Well, what I think is one of the better ideas we've had in our group and with our colleagues ever, really, from our personal where we sit, we've come to realize that a lot of the programs we need have already been built by other people in the game industry. For those of you who don't know what a game engine is, or a video game engine, they are things like Unreal or Unity. I think many people in this community are using them in all sorts of ways, but they are basically tools that allow a game designer to make an immersive, let's say, 3D world that's never existed, but that a player can explore from an immersive first-person perspective and interact with in real time, interact with the objects and the other agents. And the toolkit allows the game designer to build this thing without having to write everything from scratch, without having to write all of computer graphics, because there's a graphics engine, which is not like Pixar quality. It's just designed to look good enough and to render really, really fast in real time, let's say using a GPU. Or physics engines, which are not the kind of physical simulation tools that, say, physicists use because they want to get everything right down to a detailed level. Again, they're just designed to capture enough of everyday physics to look good, and to be really fast. Okay, so they're good, cheap, fast approximations to graphics and physics, and even to what's called planning. So game AI are simple models of how agents act with goals and models of the world. And I think these tools are, again, some people think this is crazy, and other people think it might be obviously right. I think it's kind of right, that these tools have recapitulated in, let's say, the Silicon Valley, what evolution might have built into our brains and many other brains too, okay, not just human brains. So by embedding these in a framework for probabilistic inference, we can model intuitive physics and intuitive psychology. And I'm going to just introduce these models a little bit, just sketch them out. I mean, in this talk, I don't have time to go into too many details, or really any. But I want to, again, illustrate the approach, mostly working on intuitive physics. And what you'll see here in intuitive physics, this is just a zoom in on that model there. This is a sketch that, if for those of you who know about graphical models and, say, hidden Markov models, you could recognize this as a kind of hidden Markov model. There's a latent world state, there's an observation variables, it's only the things on the bottom, the images that we directly observe. We have to work backwards to figure out the latent world state, and then we can then work forwards from that to say, predict what's going to happen or guide our action planning. That's just like the HMM or the MDP, Markov Decision Process, or POMDP toolkit. The difference is, unlike a hidden Markov model, the representation of the observables and the world state are not vectors, and these arrows, the functions relating them, are not matrices, but again, they are things like CAD programs. Again, very rough approximate ones, but I think we need this. I think it's almost self-evident when you really get into it, to describe the richness of a world of objects that you can play with, right? So a world state for us is going to be something like a CAD specification of 3D objects, their sizes and shapes, key properties like mass, friction, elasticity, exactly the things you need in the state for a game physics engine, which is not everything about the physics, but just enough to run one of these very fast, rough and ready, approximate, let's say, Newtonian simulators. That's how you say work forward. And then there's also this game approximate graphics renderer. So you're seeing here a little block scene. I'll show you some more. These are examples of these blocks world scenes. And the idea is you see an image, you work backwards to make a guess at what would have been the input to an approximate graphics renderer that would have produced the observed image, and then that guess is that state estimate in the upper left there, which you can then propagate through your physics engine and imagine what happens. Both of these arrows are probabilistic. You can't make that guess perfectly, we posit, and you can't perfectly localize the 3D objects from one image. There's a little bit of uncertainty, and you might have a little bit, or maybe sometimes a lot of uncertainty about exactly how the physics works. So the best you can do is make a good guess, and what you see here, if you follow through this set of blocks here, is propagating an uncertain guess a few steps forward in time, and you see in this case you have an unstable scene where most of the blocks have fallen. Here's another guess. Each of these, if you're familiar with Monte Carlo inference, each of these represents like one particle or one sample through time of what we think might happen. The details are different, but the key, look at these two different things, is that after a few time steps, basically the same thing happens, which is all the blocks mostly have fallen down. So this is a way to model our sense of stability. And as an example of how we use this in work that I started doing with Pete Battaglia and Jess Hamrick, both of whom are now at DeepMind, and pursuing some interestingly related work, we started off by giving people these blocks tower scenes. This is work that was published a few years ago in PNAS, and Jess did part of it in her PhD thesis, also in cognition, where we give people these scenes. We have them judge, let's say on some graded scale, how stable any one of these scenes is. Probably most of you would agree the ones in the upper left are pretty stable, and as you move down to the lower right, increasingly unstable. And we get, for example, behavioral data that look like this. So in this plot, each of these pluses is one stimulus. There's 60 of them, repeated a number of times in the experiment. On the y-axis, you see the average human judgment of stability on a 1 to 7 scale. So a high value means very likely the whole tower is going to fall. A low value means very likely it's just stable. There's an error bar. And then on the y-axis, you see the predictions of this, what we call the intuitive physics engine, which was this probabilistic approximate simulator, which makes a guess, a pretty good, but just slightly probabilistic guess of the objects, and propagates some of that uncertainty through. And what you can see is it really does quite a good job quantitatively of predicting people's sense of stability. In the paper, and in other work that we and others have done, we've shown how the same model, I mean, in some cases exactly the same model, and others basically the same model, can answer not only this question of will the blocks fall, but many other questions. And this is a way of getting at least in the domain of intuitive physics, this flexible general purpose intelligence, right? So unlike in today's machine learning approaches where you define a task and then you train up a network to solve that task, for us in intuitive physics, the task is just simply just just think about the world, basically. Understand, model the physics, and then you can query that system in so many ways, including ways that you have lots of experience with, and other ways that you don't have any experience with until someday you have to do it. So we can ask questions like, will the blocks fall? Which way will they fall? How far will they fall? We can go in and in a cognitive way, sort of intervene on the parameters of the system. So we can say, what happens if the gray material is 10 times heavier than the green material, or much heavier? Well, look at those two scenes, which are geometrically identical. They've just been recolored. That will change your sense of which way the blocks will fall, or whether they will fall. Or if you see some things like the red and yellow blocks that are surprisingly stable, then can you infer from that that maybe the red or yellow material is much heavier than the other? And indeed, people can. This is some of the work that Hamrick did. Or consider a task like this, which I said, again, here's something which, unless you've seen me talk about this or read the paper, you probably haven't done this before. It's not like a question of, will this stack fall, which we all have lots of experience and could have applied various pattern recognition approaches to. But here's a new task that uses, we would argue, the same intuitive physics engine. So if I have some red and yellow blocks on a table, and imagine that I bump the table hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor. Is it going to be more red or yellow blocks? So you tell me. We'll make this interactive. Say red or yellow. Here. Okay, good. So I think you see what's going on. It was designed to elicit a little bit of uncertainty, because again, this is probabilistic. And as those of you who have a behavioral toolkit know, there's lots of ways, or there's several good ways to measure uncertainty. One is just reaction time latency, longer response, more uncertainty. The other is just kind of mumbles and blurs, all right? Graded scales. What's going on in your mind and in your brain to compute the answers to these? I gave you 10 of these scenes, but I really could have gone on all day, all right? Well, here's a window into one of these game physics simulations. So in this one here, we bump the table a little bit. Here's a harder bump. And you can see that very different things happen for a light bump and a hard bump. But basically the same thing happens. At the level that matters for cognition and action planning, it's just the yellow blocks are going over. And so it doesn't really matter which of those simulations you run. You can run one or the other or a couple. You also notice only have to run the simulation for a few time steps, right? You don't have to run it all the way to the end. So this is the kind of rough and ready, approximate idea that we're putting out there, all right? The simulations could also, these simulations are accurate in certain ways that surely the brains are not. But the key is that just a few of these samples in a probabilistic approximate engine can capture these and many other judgments. This is just, again, a similar scatter plot. And though the task is much more familiar, the model is just as accurate, and there's no reprogramming or relearning. It's just the same model. Now, to actually start to bring the brain into the picture, here I want to point to some work that's mostly been going on in Nancy Cambisher's lab, my colleague, who I think you'll hear from on the panel later, in a paper that was led by Jason Fisher, who was a postdoc with her and is now faculty at Hopkins. And I also want to point to some new work that Sarah Schwetman, who's a PhD student with Nancy and also with me, are doing. Jason and colleagues took some of these tasks, including the towers tasks and these other ones, which again, unfortunately, are kind of hard to see down here, but maybe you'll see enough to see there's like sort of bouncing balls versus like dots chasing each other. Very nicely controlled stimuli and tasks to really isolate in difficulty and stimulus material controlled ways what we think are intuitive physical calculations, and found a network of brain areas that seems to be responsible for these. And you can read the PNAS paper from last year to learn more about this. But I just want to highlight that this isn't a new network. It's not like this is a set of brain areas nobody's ever tried to characterize before. And in particular, it seems to overlap with action planning and maybe even tool use areas, which I think is telling us something interesting about the evolutionary origins of this physics engine in the brain. I think, again, if you look at the engineering toolkit, for example, a lot of the work right now in robot motion planning by people like Emo Todorov or Russ Tedrake and others uses physics engines as a central part of trajectory optimization-based motor planning. Or if you think about how am I going to manipulate this object to use it as a tool, again, I think our best approaches are starting to use the same kinds of physics engines in some broad sense that we're using here. Now, so this is just the first step in that top-down, where the top-down trajectory meets up with the brain. The next step, once you've found some relevant brain areas, the key ones, is to try to understand what they're doing. What are the representations, right? What are the algorithms at all relevant levels of neural circuitry? So again, unfortunately, I'll just tell you the key representational questions, which are cut off on the bottom here. But things like what properties of objects are represented, such as is mass represented, friction, and so on? What are the events going on? In physics engines are crucially both object-based but also event-driven. So a collision event is a very particular kind of thing, and there's particular ways of modeling that. Does your brain also have something like, for example, collision events? We think that it does. What kind of relations, like support and attachment, and what kind of dynamics? Like, physics engines use concepts of force, for example. Are there actual concepts of force represented and computed in these areas? We think it's at least an interesting hypothesis that each and every one of those might be there, or might not, right? There might be things we haven't thought about. So Sarah Schwetman is starting to work on this by, for example, recently having shown that that basically giving people really cool, compelling videos of objects splashing into water or hitting other objects or hitting rubber sheets and so on, things that give strong motion cues to mass, that people perceive the mass and you can decode the mass. This is just a pattern classification accuracy decoding from these physics areas, different levels of mass. which would say which object is heavier or lighter, or 3 different levels of mass. Those 6 bars are 6 individual subjects, so you can decode with pretty high accuracy in each and every individual subject. And that's true when people are making a mass judgment, but also if they've previously seen and made a mass judgment, but now they're just asked to, say, judge the color, fine-grained color discrimination, that mass is still being computed in these areas. So we think this is just the first step in what's hopefully going to be a very exciting program of trying to see what aspects of these physical representations that we at the computational cognitive level think might be going on in the brain. And then let's take that down to the actual neural circuit level. So collaborating with Vinrik Friewald and people in his lab, we're just starting to plan out a set of experiments. They're just in the planning stages to look at analogous questions in non-human primates. Now, then we might ask, okay, so let's say we start to characterize these neural circuits. What are going to be neurally viable models? So for example, can we take neural networks and, let's say the standard neural network toolkit of machine learning, and get it to do these kinds of computations and use that as a hypothesis for what the brain does, much as, say, Jim DiCarlo and Dan Yeamans have done in their work in object recognition? I think possibly, but it's very challenging. One initial attempt to use neural networks is this very nice work here by the Facebook AI group, led by Lehrer and Rob Fergus, others. It's Adam Lehrer. And they trained a network that they called FizzNet, which was basically taking the deep convolutional net, the same kind of architecture that's been used in object recognition, and trying to get it to predict block stability. And it does okay. And in some ways, it can be trained to do better than humans, okay, on these scenes. But it requires a huge amount of training data. In their work here, 200,000 examples, and just of cubes, 2, 3, and 4 cubes. And I think it's, they didn't really try to see how far they could push that to generalize. But I think everybody is skeptical that this approach, just on its own, just training basically a convnet to predict whether the blocks will fall in a classifier or just blurs of color over a few steps without really representing something about objects in physics. It's really unclear that would generalize to all those different kinds of computations that I've shown you can do. We can then ask, well, maybe the neural network isn't being trained to make a particular decision, like will it fall, but to actually build a physics engine, like a neural physics engine. So in some interesting work going back about 10 years, Jeff Hinton and Ilya Sutskever and a number of others tried to do this, and they built something that could model a little bit, balls bouncing around in a box, but not very well, honestly, and everybody agrees that it didn't work very well. It worked better than some other ones. But the key thing here is they were, again, trying to use, just like in the FAIR model, a distributed representation. There weren't any real objects in the representation here, and there weren't here either. This was basically a kind of distributed temporal Boltzmann machine, and the idea was to see if the object-based dynamics could somehow emerge, and it kind of does, but not really. More recently, there's been several really interesting papers. One, probably the most developed, from Pete Battaglia and colleagues at DeepMind, called Interaction Networks, and another one done by a really bright undergrad who was at MIT at the time, Michael Chang, who's now a PhD student at Berkeley, what he called neural physics engines. And this is another approach in which you actually build in objects and forces. So it's symbolic in the sense that it really represents the scene in terms of objects and their positions and velocities and state, and objects interact pairwise with forces, but it learns how the forces work using a fairly simple neural network sort of strategy. And this model is able to build much more accurate models. But as far as serving as a guide for how things work in the brain, it's in some ways, it's more of a challenge, because things that we have yet to really understand how to do in neural populations, like represent objects and relations, the classic stuff of symbolic processing, these architectures build in, okay, or build in explicitly, not in neural terms. Okay, it's not really about what you build in versus learn, but it's about what looks like neurons. So I just want to sort of say this is pretty much where the story of intuitive physics in the brain ends, and for computational people, this is where the challenges begin. Okay. Now, the same kind of thing, I got it. The same kind of thing, well, on my timing, I have 34 minutes, but okay. Or rather, so okay. 5 or 6 minutes, I will be done. I will basically skip over intuitive psychology. I mean, I could stop here because this is just a case study that illustrates the points I wanted to make. But just to give you a sense of the toolkit, you can do the same kind of thing for intuitive psychology. Here, I did a lot of this work with Chris Baker and Julian Hara-Edinger, and really guided by collaborations with Rebecca Sachs. All of these papers, or this Nature Human Behavior paper, for example, suggests a similar way to use, if you like, sort of simple agent planning models to make sense of how we infer other agents' beliefs and desires. And then recently in some engineering work, we're taking this to be able to look at, say, a person moving around and infer their goal, using, again, sort of robot physics engine-based action planning, and then inverting that to figure out what's the likely goal. You know, you assume that the agent is planning efficiently, and you say, what's the likely goal that explains their action? And again, really pointing to work going forward in the future, some from Rebecca Sachs's lab, Nancy Canwisher's lab, joint students of theirs like Ben Dean, or for example, the current postdoc in Nancy's lab, Leila Ishak, is trying to say, well, how can we study, again, these kinds of computational cognitive models in the brain, in brain systems that have been shown already to care about people's goals or beliefs or mental states, or, for example, you know, social interactions in some recent work by Leila and Nancy. These models can be turned into models of multi-agent systems by having the planners be recursively referenced. Again, the symbolic or the probabilistic program toolkit is so powerful here, because you can have a model that does planning with beliefs and desires that reference that agent's model of another agent's beliefs and desires. And we think that's how do you look at a scene like this one and say one guy's helping another, or this scene and say, well, it's the opposite of helping, right? That requires having models of agents who have models of the other agent's minds. Okay. So we don't really have time also to talk about the model-based learning. And here, I want to just talk about it for a minute or two, just again to put out the challenges for computational cognitive neuroscience. You know, you guys already referenced at the beginning the work that we did in the science paper trying to get at one-shot learning. Okay. And since this paper got a lot of attention, I won't rehearse it. But the key here is we tried to say, well, how can you say, learn a new object concept from one example and recognize those as the same kind of thing? We did it with these handwritten characters where, again, sort of inspired by what had developed over the pattern recognition and especially the neural network community, we noted that these very simple images, just taking handwritten characters in all the world's alphabets, can serve as a great test bed for simple visual concept learning. And we built a model of how you do this, which again takes the classic idea of what we call analysis by synthesis, right? It goes back at least to Helmholtz. The idea that you perceive an object and can learn a concept by inverting the causal process that led to it. So you look at that object there and ask yourself, how would you draw this character? Just draw it in the air in front of you. Okay, so you did something like that, right? Okay, and this idea of being able to invert the causal process, that idea, you know, we're not the first to suggest that by any means. People in neural networks and machine learning, like Jeff Hinton and colleagues, okay, but also psychologists who studied how people learn to read and write, or neuroimagers who've been studying the representation of characters or words in the brain, have found evidence for this kind of process. Again, that we perceive writing, or you know, we read in some sense by inverting writing. But we haven't really had good computational models of how this works that are really up to the task of explaining how you could infer that motor program from one example. So that's what we did here. This was work that Brendan Lake, who's just started as a faculty member at NYU, did in his thesis. He built an actual model of this. And I don't have time to tell you the details, but you know, again, maybe some of you know this work. But he said, what are the key things you need? What is the engineering toolkit? You need programs which capture individual characters. You need higher level programs which generate character level programs. And he built up a really impressive modeling framework capturing what are the motor primitives, what are the relations, what are the statistics that you would have to learn from other characters to transfer to these characters, and then some kind of idea of the algorithms that might allow you to invert these motor programs. And that gives a set of, what does that give to neuroscience? Well, I think it gives, first of all, possible engineering models, some of the first we've had, for how these things could work in the brain. Okay? It gives targets and challenges for neuroscience, right? You want to drag me off? He's the one guy, he's my boss, so he's the one guy I have to listen to. Well, okay. Here's our model doing impressive things. Again, maybe many of you have seen this. Let me just in order to, again, give the challenge for people who are interested in neuroscience, right? If you look at, well, okay. Sorry, my timer says 38 minutes, so okay, I thought I had 40. 1 minute, okay. Here's some awesome stuff from DeepMind. Okay, 1 minute 10. And what you can see is impressive And, like our model, it takes one character and can synthesize new examples. But if you look closely, if you look at the columns, right, you'll see that in many cases, it's clearly not capturing what you see in these characters. Some of these things are other instances of the same character, some of them aren't. And what this has done, again, this is seeing how far you can go with a really nice recurrent neural network at what's called a draw architecture, which has been optimized for drawing. But what we see when we look at this is that we have models which don't have enough of that symbolic architecture. They don't have enough compositional causal structure yet to capture the kind of action plans that we see and produce in this domain. So it's the challenge for computational neuroscience and anybody interested in neural networks in engineering or in the brain. How do we get this to work? Okay, so now I'll go to my last slide, skipping the cool model-based RL and Atari that we're doing, but taking Jim's guidance really right. Okay, so I'll just say, what I've tried to sketch out is what is this top-down toolkit? What might this offer? At the computational level, picking out the key kinds of computations we should be interested in human cognition, namely intelligence as model building, okay, and giving some examples of that. And then insights that, again, draw on decades of work in cognitive science about what are some algorithmic principles, such as the idea that we have to have probabilistic inference operating over symbolic representations. We have to think about compositionality and causality. We need objects and their relations and their interactions as the heart of our mental models. And then drawing on recent engineering ideas, including some of neural networks, but a lot of other things like probabilistic programs and game engines, which are providing the engineering tools for reverse engineering these algorithmic ideas in the mind and brain. And then, again, the last thing that's sort of cut off here is what this offers to the more implementation or circuit level of computational neuroscience is hopefully some targets, things to look for to try to do, and some challenges, ways in which seeing that the current toolkit we have in neural networks might not be enough, but hopefully providing some inspiration and maybe even some guidance for how to grow that engineering toolkit. Okay, thanks.